Welcome to the Flux Dev Meeting for June 21st. If we have any agenda items, please add them to the topics list. And if we have anyone who'd like to speak first, looking for volunteers. Also like to welcome anyone who's new to the call. If anyone needs access to write to the agenda, we can also accomplish that. And the agenda doc has been linked in the chat.
Should I just start with my question or my topic?
Sure.
I wanted to discuss about an update to the RFC 004, I think, where we are adding more things about how proxy configurations are considered. It's about, what's RFC about? RFC is about insecure HTTP connections in all of the Flux controllers. And the new statements behave in some contradictory ways. It's like if using a flag, you disable HTTP, but proxy is enabled through environment variables, we ignore it. If the HTTP proxy is provided in environment variable, we ignore it because insecure connection is disabled. But when the same is described in a reconciliation loop, we fail. So I'm not sure if that's okay, or what's the expectation of the user? Should a confusing or incorrect proxy configuration be ignored, or should it result in a failure? Does that make sense? What would the user expect? Should
Do you
operation
really want
be
to
stopped?
I would, my initial reaction would be to shut it down and say crash and fail if the configuration is invalid, but then I'm concerned about might land users in a state where they can't any longer pull changes if you do that. So
For some reason, I think in case of environment variables, you can just ignore if your proxy configuration is bad and continue working. But what do you do in a reconciliation loop? Should you, where you specify, you declaratively specify that this is the proxy you want to use. Now, declarative configuration may have high priority. Should you respect it more than an environment variable? I don't know, what's the expectation? Any opinions?
Hey, so I don't think we should ignore anything. If any configuration, being environments or whatever, is not correct or is prohibited by the allow HTTP flag, then we should error out and never crash, of course. A controller should never crash.
So the controller manager, the main process, should also not start at all?
no, it should run, but error, just emit an error constantly.
Allow, you mean?
Or
Like, so there is a difference in what do you do in the outside the reconciliation loop and in the reconciliation, what do you do? Should they be same or should they be different? If we say it should fail everywhere. Controller will not start itself, and pod will just terminate, or another pod will come. Do we want that?
If we don't start the reconciliation and we error some message in the logs, then people that have set up monitoring, they will not be aware of it because you don't have any failure metrics. The reconciler hasn't started. So that's bad, in my opinion. We should start the reconciler, fail everything. People will get alerts. Also, source controller should send all these failures to notification controller. Notification controller let people know that all sources are bad and so on.
Again, we are mixing the two, right? Until you have an object, you cannot send notification to the notification controller, which operates on objects.
Yes.
But what do you do outside the object? In the controller manager level, what do you do? Not in the reconciliation, outside of it. Should you fail or should you ignore?
Outside, nothing. We shouldn't check the HTTP environments, right? The proxy environments. Are we doing this or what?
According to the PR, we will. I was confused, so I asked for clarification, and the response was, we'll have different behaviors for the control manager and the reconcilers. And I think for an administrator and a user of the API, they would see different things if this is the way we do things. An administrator will see logs of the control manager, but the user of the API will not see. They will just see the events on the objects.
How will the administrator see an error if we don't start the control loop?
The administrator can see the pod logs.
Why do you assume people use logs for monitoring?
Not monitoring, like you can, if a pod is failing, you can check the log, right? What's happening with the pod.
Yeah, but unless we're in crash loop back off, you're not gonna check the log.
That's what would happen.
Well, if your cluster has some integration with, like it sends to Loki or something, you can look at the logs of the pod with kubectl, but it would still be ingesting logs somewhere where it could look, right?
So we make assumption of how people monitor Flux, and I think is wrong. Some people monitor Flux Prometheus metrics, and that's what most of them do. You look at the logs after you receive an alert, or by notification controller or by alert manager. No one sits at their computer looking at Flux logs all day.
But people will have metrics of failing pods, right? As soon as something fails, they'll get an alert that the pod is failing.
It's a flag misconfiguration in general, right? If you configure the wrong log level, it will fail. If you configure an HTTP proxy environment variable where it's not supported, the pod will fail to start. I think fanning out dozens and dozens of events while the core of the issue is a configuration issue that only the operator can solve and the user can can't do anything about, isn't the right solution.
So what do you do?
So you want to crash loop, Hide? That's what you are saying?
If a user support or if an operator configures an HTTP proxy environment variable while he also has a flag enabled that actively configures the pod or configures the controller to not make use of that or not allowed to make use of it, then it should fail. Yes, because it's a misconfiguration.
But if the proxy is in the spec,
Then it's a user error and the object should log or pull an event about it. It's about the environment variable on the pod being a controller-wide configuration option which isn't supported by the configure flag versus a user-provided configuration value which isn't supported by the configuration of the operator. There are two different kind of errors and two different kind of user types which can resolve these errors.
what
It
if
only makes
what if in the spec I put an HTTPS proxy and the environment
then
variable
that
is
doesn't
HTTP?
change anything about the thing I'm saying. You're then making a misconfiguration on the object itself. So the object itself should tell you that something is wrong with that object. The
No,
other
I'm
error
saying
scenario,
the other way around. So in spec I put HTTPS, which would pass the restriction of the flag, but the environment variable of the pod is at HTTP. Let's assume all objects have the proxy in spec, all of them are HTTPS.
I'm not following what you're saying.
So both environment variable is set and the spec field is set. Which one takes priority right now? The one in
Spec
spec,
should.
right?
If the controller succeeded to start based on the flags that are being passed, then it's the responsibility of the object to do further validation. So then the error automatically becomes apparent at the level of the object.
Yeah, no, I was saying that the spec in the object is good, but the environment variable is bad. And you are saying it will never.
Then the controller will never start because the core configuration of the controller doesn't allow it to go beyond the point of booting the actual manager and the further reconcilers. So it will just crash loop, and once that's solved and the operator has adjusted the configuration, it will continue to process things again.
Yeah, cool. Okay. But we need to tell people that with this change, basically you can get Flux into a state where you can't fix it anymore. You have to connect to the cluster. So if you do a Flux bootstrap, then in your Git repo, you set the environment variable to HTTP. Later on, some other admin that is not aware of that comes and sets the allow flag to false. The moment it does a commit, source controller crash loop everywhere. You can no longer fix it through Git. You need to go on the cluster, do a manual patch. When source controller will start, you'll get all configuration will crash loop again. So you have to synchronize the change in Git. Have to do it at the same time. The kubectl patch to fix the anyway. Yeah, you should test it out and see how you can recover from this stuff. But it's clearly once we decide to crash loop source controller, we should be aware that this will break Flux everywhere, and then people have to manually go into potentially hundreds of clusters to fix it because Flux can no longer fix itself.
So do we want to enable that? Or avoid it? No opinion.
Well,
I say at the beginning, I think it's bad to intentionally crash loop source control, which breaks Flux automatically upgrade, self-healing, and everything.
The only time when it's not bad is when the configuration would make it such that every source downstream would necessarily be broken too. And then it makes more sense to crash loop because it makes it more visible. But it sounds like that wouldn't be necessarily the case if some specs were correct.
The moment you crash loop the pod, you lose control. You need
I think there's little way around it, because what this RC tries to do is it tries to improve the security posture, right? And any thing we do which would make the controller go beyond the point of booting and the environment variables being taken into account by all the other things would kind of make it insecure as soon as it boots, because it's doing something that's not allowed to do. So I don't see much room to not do that.
So, from a user perspective, um, one thing is that I agree that if a pod has wrong configuration, then it should crash loop until the configuration is fixed. That's like what I'm used to. Like, that sounds fair to me. But in case, like for the specific case where Flux, like we wouldn't be able to fix the problem for Flux specifically by Git, as Stefan said, like changing to fix this problem, we would have to kubectl edit. That's kind of like for Flux, that's kind of something that I think sucks a little bit. That would suck a little bit, you know, but I usually like the crash loop. Like if the configuration of a pod is wrong, then it crash loops. That's totally normal to me.
Yeah, I think by making such configurations, you're breaking the core engine. So it's inevitable then to kind of not go in and fix it. Or, well, there are other ways around it, right? If you're managing your Flux installation with Terraform and you figure out that you have a wrong configuration, you run your Terraform thing again after making changes, and your general state isn't kind of.
I'm doing the opposite. I'm running my Terraform with Flux, with the F controller in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, upgrading Flux with Terraform is a very shitty experience in my opinion, compared to what Flux can do itself. No connection to the clusters. Like you push the new Flux config into the repo, and that's how Flux upgrades itself. You don't need to connect to hundreds of clusters every time there is a new version. But yeah, with this, we can break this whole procedure, which is fine. I don't know.
I was thinking that this is a scenario where your environment variable is saying use an insecure proxy, and Flux is configured to not use insecure. So even if you ignore that insecure proxy configuration, Flux can operate as usual, right? Isn't that okay? They will not break anything in Flux. Flux will still be in the secure state. It's just in ignoring the insecure configuration that someone is trying to enable.
And then we emit an error message about it, but it's a warning.
A
And then
warning.
we don't have this nightmare scenario where you can't fix Flux at all through Git.
Yeah, instead of a panic, it's an error, and it will get
And continue.
locked at the start. It will continue, and then it will. You do what? You do OS remove. You remove the environment variable from the process itself.
Oh, because we can't just send a signal down, disregard the wrong config, but we could remove it from the environment.
Wait, why do you need to remove it?
Because otherwise, all the code that's downstream is still going to act on that wrong config. You'll get.
We do have control over those, right? So when we enable this proxy configuration in object level, we have control over all in the object level.
We are talking about the environment variable, right?
Environment variable affecting the objects.
Yeah.
So objects have their own proxy configuration. When you say environment, you're ignoring. When you are reconciling the objects, maybe it can decide should it use or not use. So maybe delete the boundary.
So if the proxy is wrongly configured or breaks the policy in the environment variable, you check that at startup, you write an error message, then you have to configure all reconcilers to ignore those variables, or you can remove them from the process environment. So the Go HTTP client will not look at them, the bucket client will not look at them, and so on, right? Because
That should
the
also
Go
work.
native HTTP client does a lookup of the proxies, if I'm not mistaken, and other, right? So that's why
I think this would be
after
much
we load it,
safer.
we should remove it or do something with it. So we are sure it never acts on it.
I think this would be much safer because maybe in some of the reconcilers we don't have for object proxy configuration available. So this would be safer. Okay. So the next stage, you start now, you don't fail. Now in the per object level, when you have this conflict, what do? Do you, again, the object configuration is trying to make you go an insecure way, but the flag is not letting you go insecure. Should you fail the reconciliation or log a error message and event and then continue working as you are? It's the same scenario, but it's an object level. What do? Should you fail the reconciliation or should you just continue?
So it's the
Using
proxy
sig-
configuration is what we're,
Proxy. Object level proxy configuration.
so the question is it safe to just disregard this instruction in any case? Or should we fail?
In case of environment variable, you decide to ignore it. In case of object level, where we have this declarative API, should we ignore it or should we just fail?
Because
Fail
it's
and
a,
retry over and over.
because it's a security consideration, but there's a chance that if we disregard this instruction, we can just recover when Git updates itself. But
That's for the previous one. I'm talking about object level.
Well, if the object is bootstrapped itself. I guess that would really only be true of the root object.
Again, it's like the configuration is telling you to go insecure, but the manager flag is telling you to not go insecure. So even if you ignore it, you're okay. You can ignore it and be okay with it, or you can not ignore it and fail the reconciliation.
I would fail the reconciliation, set the ready message to, you configure this proxy, which is disallowed by this setting, contact your cluster administrator. So people, for example, a tenant which sets up a HTTP proxy, but the cluster admin disallow it. It gets a notification on Slack. It sees the message, oh, I'm not allowed to use HTTP proxy. I have to switch to HTTPS.
I think it also depends on how we pass the proxy configuration. In case of, I think we discussed recently, in case of notification control, the provider has proxy as a field inside spec as itself, the address. But I think we discussed to move it to a secret. if you move it to a secret can be updated outside of the reconciliation. We cannot do a stall condition in the object. Someone needs, someone can update the secret and it can just work.
Right.
So it has
Not
to be
stalled.
retried.
He's not stalled.
It's retry or again and again.
Yes.
There.
Yeah, he's like he's the same as, I don't know, cosine verification failed, right? They can re-sign it afterwards or whatever. So we should retry.
And send a notification saying what's the cause of the failure and then continue retrying.
Yeah, just retry all the time. I'm no fan of stall, but that's just me.
Okay, I think that clears everything. Okay, that's my question. Wasn't sure what the user would expect from this.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. Just a reminder for anyone who wants access to the agenda doc to be able to edit, just send me your Gmail and a DM. I'm not sure where those requests go, so I won't see them. And is there anyone who'd like to speak next, or is there another topic on the agenda? Looks like no. We can give that another minute. Okay, well, if we've run out of topics, then I think it's time to close the meeting. Thanks,
Cool.
everyone. Oh,
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.